Chilling tales for dark nights.
The Forgetful House. Written by James Colton. Performed by G.M. Danielson. I stared up at the looming edifice in the crisp winter afternoon. I found it hard to believe that this was my house now, that after all these years I was returning as its master. The circumstances weren't at all what I'd wanted, but then again, what had I expected? There was no other way. My house, I muttered. How many times had I called it that as a child? Yet now, to actually utter the words felt wrong. They held a new meaning, a meaning that didn't seem at all right. There was a loud clatter as Mike slid open the door of the moving van. "Let's get started," he said. "Go ahead and start unloading," I replied to Mike and my two other friends, Eric and Ryan. "I'm going to go through and get all the doors open." I fished a heavy set of keys from my pocket, one for every room. I knew from my parents' in-house nurse that most of the doors inside were locked. It kept them from getting too lost, she said. The entryway smelled strongly of dust, and beneath that was a subtle odor that I recognized immediately. Every house has a peculiar scent, one you can detect on any of its residents, and that defines the family. This was my smell, my family's smell. It smelled like home. Leaving the front door open for my friends as they began carting in the furniture, I strode down the hallway, pausing at each door as I searched for the right key to open it. Once I was done with the first floor, I headed upstairs. There were 5 bedrooms up there, and a bathroom. Once more, I worked my way down, unlocking doors, until I came to the last room on the right, the master bedroom. I got as far as putting the key to the lock, when I paused. This was where it had happened. I slowly withdrew my hand. There was no reason to go in there. No reason to disturb that room. Returning downstairs, I was met with a surprise. Several boxes were stacked in the hallway, and all 3 of my friends had shed their coats and were brushing large clumps of snow from their limbs. "That blizzard came out of nowhere," said Ryan. I glanced out the window. Indeed, I couldn't see across the street. The snow was falling so heavily. "The weatherman didn't call for a storm," I said. "Well, you know how reliable they are," answered Eric. "There's no point in working in that. So we figured we'd just crash here for a while and wait it out." So that's exactly what we did. We unpacked the few boxes that had made it inside and rearranged some of the already existing furniture. But the storm showed no signs of waning. "I guess that's what you get for moving so close to the Great Lakes," said Ryan as we stared out the windows. "I hope your microwave made it inside." It had, and so we prepared a quick dinner, which we ate in the living room. I stared at the roaring blaze in the fireplace. It got dark outside quickly, owing to the short days of winter and the raging blizzard, and before long, our little corner of the house was the only one still blessed with light. Everywhere else had fallen into hushed and dusty silence. We laughed heartily, letting the echoes of our mirth fill the chamber in defiance of winter's fury. What could the storm do to us in here? We had warmth and light, and our good humor ignited our spirits as it reverberated off the walls, bouncing from ceiling to floor, corner to corner, until the entire room seemed alive with cheerful idiots. It was more than a cozy chamber could contain. Our laughter spilled out into the empty corridors, where it struggled with the darkness, failed, and died miserably away, just like Mother. "Hey," bellowed Eric, the remnants of a joke still showing at the corners of his eyes. "What's come over you?" I recovered myself. "Sorry," I apologized. "Say, the other week..." The mood was restored as I launched into a comical tale invented on the spot. Our laughter resumed, and I followed it as it soared over my head and out the door to my back, out once more into those darkened hallways where nothing but shadows moved. I listened to it as it stirred the dust in its last feeble death throes, watched as the shapes, satisfied that their murderous work was done, retreated to their quiet posts. "Are you sure you're all right?" asked Ryan. "My imagination," I replied, shaking my head as I turned back to face my friends. "Perhaps I should get myself to bed." Eric spared a glance at the dusty grandfather clock that rested in the corner. "If that thing still worked," he said, "then I dare say we should all follow your lead." "It's worse than that, I'm afraid," said Mike, looking up from his watch. "I suggest we call it a night before we all start having hallucinations. Who knows what the midnight hour could do to our fragile minds?" Everyone chuckled at his remark. Except me. Familiarity breeds fear. Paradoxical, I know. Perhaps you can't realize when things are wrong unless you are intimately aware of how things should be. As I walked the corridors on my way to bed, I was aware. I had, after all, grown up in this house. I knew all its nooks and crannies. I knew how shadows fell across the floor and climbed up the walls. I knew the lumpy mass hovering to my right was just my father's coat hanging on a doorknob, except that Father was dead, and there was no door. But why shouldn't there have been a door there? I pondered the question as I passed, refusing to give the lumpy shape a second glance. Yes, there should have been. Once everything was settled down, I'd have one installed. Who cared if it opened into nothing? At least then there'd be a reason for Father's coat to hang there, on a doorknob that did not exist. I reached my room, shut the door, and locked it, then wondered what should happen if I had to get out in the middle of the night. I reminded myself that it already was the middle of the night, and my other worry. What if something tried to get in, kept me from unlocking it? But what should want to get in? I tried not to think about it as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed. It was my house, except it wasn't. It was my parents' house. I settled down under the covers, sinking into the silence of my parents' house. Elsewhere, my friends were quickly falling asleep, unfamiliar, unaware. They couldn't possibly realize that the tree which they'd all admired for its aged charm earlier in the day was just a couple feet too far to the left, for it cast that particular shadow, the one that looked like a hand upon the wall. "Best get moving quickly," announced Mike as we emerged from the house. "The radio says last night's storm was just the beginning. We're about to get walloped." I really couldn't have chosen a worse time to move, but there was nothing to be done about it now. We hastily cleared a path through the foot of snow and began carting boxes and furniture inside. We had a few moments of brilliant sunshine, sparkling off the whitewashed ground like diamonds, before the clouds rolled in again. The snowflakes began to tumble lazily from the sky, and when the lake effect began to fall in earnest, we closed up the van and called it a day.
"We'll be at this all week if it keeps up,"
huffed Ryan, stomping his boots in the entryway.
"I hope you're not in a hurry to get rid of us."
I was in no hurry. In fact, I loathed the moment when I'd have to enter the house by myself, to sit and walk and sleep in its emptiness. No one to talk to or laugh with. I might have gone even so far as to say I was afraid. Not out loud, of course. We spent the rest of the afternoon shoving boxes into their proper rooms, sorting through my parents' old possessions to decide what to keep and what to throw out. I felt horribly guilty every time I placed an item in the garbage pile, convinced that it must have held some sentimental value. I wondered if Mother and Father would disapprove of my ruthless sorting. I wondered if they'd even recognize most of the heirlooms. Above the constant din of our work, the radio crackled, struggling for clear reception as the storm mucked up the signal. The weatherman prophesied a bleak forecast. At least another 2 feet of snow by tonight, as much as 3 come tomorrow morning. I wondered if my friends would ever be able to leave. They apparently shared similar sentiments.
"Well," said Eric, stretching his sore arms, "I've about had enough for today. No rush, right? Since we're stuck here until spring."
We all voiced our agreement with weak laughs, and fetching some microwave dinners from the kitchen, retired to the living room. The fire crackled merrily as we ate, and afterward we fell to talking, just as we had the previous night. The storm this time was fiercer, though, and its moans shook the house as we tried to find a way inside. The cheering effects of the warm fireplace and our full bellies were dampened beneath the ferocity of the blizzard. Our jokes were few and far between, and our conversation slid ever closer to dark subjects. At last Eric sighed.
What a storm. Nights like this are really only good for one thing."
He cast his gaze about the room, eyeing each of us in turn with a meaningful expression.
"The telling of ghost stories."
Maybe it was just the way he said it. Maybe the winter gale had finally found a chink in the house's armor. Maybe it was something else. We all shivered at his suggestion. Or was it just me?
"Come now," he chided us with a sneer. "We're all men. Show some nerve. Or do you actually believe in ghosts?"
Did I believe in ghosts? Whether I did or not was irrelevant. If they did exist, then the only ones I had to worry about in this house, in my house, were Mother and Father. Why should I be afraid of them?
"Well then," Ader continued, "since you're all so spineless, I'll go first."
He launched into his tale quietly, whispering so we had to lean forward in our chairs to listen. It turned out Eric was a masterful storyteller. As he expounded on the details of his fictional spectre, made all too real by the groaning of the wind, I realized I'd chosen the seat with its back to the door and the cold darkness behind. I was terribly aware of that empty space, that gasping space, and the air seemed to cringe behind me. Eric was reaching the climax of his story. His voice was more hushed than ever. Mike and Ryan were eating it up, but I could barely hear. I strained to make out the words, but the harder I tried, the more impossible it seemed. I felt cut off from my friends, pushed farther away into the lonely dark with each passing second, until I thought for sure they'd pass out of sight and hearing forever.
Better stop, Eric, Ryan said teasingly. Our host looks like he's about to faint. The shadows relinquished their hold, retreating into their proper corners, and I was amongst my friends again. My parents died in this house, you know. My friends exchanged nervous glances. Yes, replied Mike. You told us at the funeral. It happened in the master bedroom. I went on as if I hadn't said anything. That's the room next to yours, Mike. Then I realized everyone was staring at me, confused, scared. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why Quite all right, assured Mike. But I may demand that we may trade rooms. You're probably just tired, said Eric. We all are. I'm sure with all this heavy lifting, and in such bad weather, too. We could all use some extra rest, Ryan agreed. Maybe we should turn in early tonight. So we did. My 3 friends followed me upstairs, 3 sets of footsteps echoing my own. The first disappeared as we passed Ryan's room. He said goodnight and was gone. The second vanished shortly after. Then the third. The fourth persisted, and I steadfastly ignored it. I was careful as I entered my bedroom and shut the door, not to turn, for in turning I might see, and in seeing I might lose my already tenuous grasp on reason. I changed quickly and dove between the blankets, not giving myself time to wonder if I'd made the bed that morning, or if the sheets had been mussed up like that all day. I lay there, far from restful, my eyes darting here and there, as I tried to keep them from resting on any one spot long enough to notice what was wrong. Deep down, I hoped one of my friends had noticed something. Maybe Mike, who slept next door to my parents' bedroom, was frightened enough by my outburst in the living room to seek companionship. The hope died within me. We were all grown men. Pride would never allow us such an admission of weakness. Indeed, that was what prevented me from venturing out in search of comfort. I was ashamed of myself. There I was, cowering like a child in my own house, my parents' house, I reminded myself. It had never been mine, not since I moved out to start college. No, I was a stranger now. I had no more right to call the place mine than Eric or Mike or Ryan. A stranger in my parents' house. I finally tried closing my eyes, and that helped. Blind, I couldn't notice the wayward shadows. I couldn't acknowledge the drifting shapes. I could only listen. Listening, I could only be aware of the howling wind, the groaning house, the knocking pipes. Then there was a high-pitched whine, a click. I opened my eyes, and by the sudden absence of my alarm clock's gentle glow, I knew the power was out. I crawled reluctantly out of bed. Without power, there was no heat. Without heat, we'd all be frozen to death by morning. I remembered that my father had a generator put in the basement when I was a child, so with a shiver I began the long trek through the house. Familiarity breeds fear. You can always tell when you pass by something that isn't there, or fail to pass by something that is. It's the emptiness you feel pulling at your shoulder, or the small of your back, the presence that pushes against you, begging to be acknowledged. In the darkness, unless you're familiar with your surroundings, you can't be aware of these things. If you know, then you can't ignore them. With my friends all accounted for, sleeping in their unfamiliar beds, the hallways were empty. I felt compelled down the expanse as a howling filled my ears. The sucking, hollow, rasping breath of my parents' house. Of course, it was just the wind and the heat.
Unsustained electricity being drained out by the winter storm. Of course it was. About a quarter of the way down, resting on one of the steps, was a dark, amorphous shape. It might have been just a shadow, but what could have cast it? I had to make a choice, and I decided that if I moved, I'd return to bed, pile on some extra blankets, and deal with the cold until morning. I waited. The shape didn't move. Just a shadow after all. Every step had one, and every step cast its own dark silhouette on the one below. Still, when I reached that step, I skipped over it. What I saw on the first floor, illuminated by the feeble brightness of the blowing snow, was desolate, foreign. It made me think of my parents and of their decayed minds right before the end. I hurried through, holding my breath lest I inhale some remnant of their disease that clung to the walls, oozed across the floor, or dripped from the ceiling. Some scrap of delirium manifested in the creeping forms that any other man, less familiar with the angles and physics of the house, would have dismissed as the trick of the light. I reached the basement door and marched down the steps, feeling those tiny gaps between the stair treads grasping at my heels. It was utterly black down there, and I had to rely on memory to find where the generator rested. After a few minutes of stumbling around blindly, I stubbed my toe against it. Kneeling down, I ran my fingers along its cool surface, fumbling as I tried to get the machine going. As the light flickered on, there was a fleeting impression at the edge of my vision, a fluttering of panicked energy. I turned my attention toward the source and beheld the dimly lit basement, cluttered with forgotten bundles and boxes. Some of the debris I recognized from my childhood. Others were unfamiliar. I tried to track down where the flurry of motion had hid itself. Was it behind that crate? Under that blanket? I realized I was being foolish. What would I do if I found what I was looking for? Break my neck as I scrambled up the uneven steps, screaming like a little girl? I turned my back on the basement and flipped the light switch off. I was better off not seeing. I thundered back upstairs, back through the shifting corridors, past the shapes I told myself weren't really there. My hand fumbled on the doorknob to my bedroom. Of course I had shut the door, right? I must have, because it was closed, and there was, I insisted, nothing else that could have shut it. Finally I stumbled inside, none too gracefully as I tripped over a pile of clothes that I knew shouldn't have been there.
"What are you doing?"
asked Eric as he propped himself up sleepily. "Wrong room," I apologized, backing out slowly and shutting the door. Lost in my own house. I couldn't help but recall how all the doors had been locked when we first arrived to keep them from getting lost. Now it was happening to me. That's why I was noticing things. Nothing was different. Nothing was wrong at all. It was me. I counted the rooms carefully this time as I proceeded all the way down to the end of the hall, making sure I chose the door on the left, the one that stood open. Had I closed it? I couldn't remember anymore, and with a chilling sense of doom, I realized I was turning into them. I lay down in my bed, and I realized I was shaking. I tried to ignore the noises, the shadows, all the aberrations that my familiarity with the house allowed me to detect. They were not aberrations. I was the aberration, just like they had been to each other. I wondered if I'd recognize my friends when I woke up. The storm, blessedly, had stopped by the time the sun rose, and my 3 friends, whom I recognized with an overwhelming sense of relief, helped me finish unloading the moving van.
"Looks like that's it," said Ryan as he slid the door shut.
"Thanks for all your help, guys," I said. "Sorry things got dragged out like that." Mike shrugged off the apology.
"Can't control the weather. At least the roads are clear."
Snowplows had been buzzing back and forth while we worked, allaying our fears of being stranded. The electricity had been restored, and everything seemed cheerful in spite of my harrowing night.
"Listen," said Eric. "Since we won't be seeing as much of each other anymore, what do you say to grabbing lunch somewhere and before we head out?"
I agreed, and we piled into my car and drove down the street to a small diner, where we talked and joked and laughed one last time together. It was unbelievably pleasant, getting out of my parents' house for once. It had been 3 days, but already I'd grown weary of the empty hallways and dusty chambers and that locked bedroom door on the 2nd floor. It would be that much more desolate once my friends were gone. I'd be alone, utterly unknown in that expansive house so full of shadows, and so terribly familiar. I began to wonder why I'd agreed to take the house. Why, after all my siblings had stated their lack of interest in the place, had I foolishly decided to move in? I was cutting myself off from my friends, trading their cheerful conversation for a constant reminder of my parents' pitiful end. It was my mother. You know how bad their Alzheimer's disease was, but it was my mother who started it. She didn't recognize my father got startled and knocked his head against the mirror. The strain was too much for them both, and they died like that, tearing at each other, each convinced in their own mind that they were fighting off an intruder. They never liked strangers coming into their house. I realized with some embarrassment that my friends were all staring at me from across the table, their burgers hovering awkwardly between their gaping mouths. Their eyes were full of concern and bewilderment.
"You know," said Eric, "I'm not sure you know how to have a good time." "You're looking kind of pale," Ryan chimed in. "Are you sure you're all right?"
"Sorry," I sighed. "Just pretend I didn't say that. Memories, you know." They all nodded slowly, their eyes betraying a lack of understanding. We finished our lunch in relative silence before driving back to the house. We said our goodbyes, then my friends climbed into the moving van and left me alone. Alone, I turned back to my parents' house, and alone, I crossed the familiar threshold, shutting the front door quietly behind me and locking it. I gazed about me, studying the piles of boxes yet to be unpacked. One of them was half open, throwing a flimsy cardboard flap into the air to reveal its crowded contents. I stared sickly at it, in the knowledge that we hadn't opened any boxes that morning. They were all taped shut. I had taped them shut, right? I thought about going over and closing up that rebellious box. But then, whether by a draft or something else, the loose panel quivered. It was a slight movement that I may have imagined, but all the same, I turned my back on it and climbed upstairs. The 2nd floor hallway gaped at me, its windowless expanse clouded with murky shadows, punctuated by pale shafts of light from the other bedrooms. At least, the ones whose doors were open. At the far end on the right, there was nothing to dispel the darkness. As I approached the heart of the gloom, the corridor marked my progress. A door hinge creaked to my left, A sighing draft hissed past my ear. The floor squeaked beneath my feet. I was being watched, prodded. I felt unwelcome, a stranger in my parents' house. I reached the end of the hall and fished the ring of keys from my pocket. As long as that door remained shut, I'd have no peace. If it was allowed to keep its secrets, then they'd haunt me forever. The only way to break the spell, I thought, was to open that door and release whatever lay coiled inside it. The lock clicked, the knob turned, the hinges reluctantly moved. Had I been expecting something? A rush of wind, a sound of panicked discovery? There was nothing. It was all as I remembered. The king-sized bed was unmade. The sheets were tangled unceremoniously atop the mattress. The dresser was covered with dust and tiny sparkling shards, pieces of the shattered mirror above. Toward this item I was drawn. I examined my reflection in the jagged remains of the mirror, observed the emptiness of the bedroom behind me. Then, compelled by a cold, invisible force, my face cracked against the broken glass.
Family Secrets by Brenda Ader. Read to you by Heather Thomas. The clock stood in the hall, one of the truly magnificent pieces of the Walter family's estate. The clock was made of heavy mahogany and showcased a large mother-of-pearl face with hands of sculpted bronze. Each hour the tall clock rumbled in the hall, resolutely calling the hour the passage of time. No one knew who originally designed the clock. Some in the family claimed it was made by an Austrian watchmaker by special commission. Others said it was given to the family many generations back as payment for some debt. No one knew for sure, but it mattered little. The general consensus was the same. Although the clock was magnificent, there was something oddly sinister about it. It was a hard thing to explain, really. It wasn't that the clock was ugly. Indeed, quite the opposite was true. It was heavily decorated with carved cherubs, shined glossy. The face radiated pink, blue, and ivory in the sun, while the heavy bronze hands moved about elegantly, their pieces intricately carved. Even the deep groan of its chiming bells resonated with a kind of stately grandeur. Guests to the house often stopped to comment on its beauty, but only at a distance. Even the most ardent admirers of its artistry rarely approached it directly. Indeed, most people walked by it quickly, suppressing a shudder. Even Nadia, one of Old Lady Rose's many descendants and the current owner of the estate, rushed past it when outright avoidance was impossible. In fact, the only person who seemed able to maintain her nerve in the face of the clock's strange atmosphere was Nadia's youngest daughter, Isabeth. At 13 years old, Isabeth was the quintessential misfit. She preferred books to play, spiders to dolls, and twilight to midday. Although she was both pale and blonde in appearance, she was a dark spirit drawn to all things macabre. However, even she was not totally immune to the influence of the clock. She'd never mentioned it to anyone, but she'd always felt oddly drawn to the elegant timepiece. Sometimes, as she made her way down the mahogany-paneled hallway, she felt as though it were actually calling to her. She found this somewhat unsettling, but also intriguing. She'd approach the wooden monolith with an odd mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Then she'd stare it down as though she were challenging it to a duel. Sometimes Nadia would catch her daughter in the act, her back rigid, her violet eyes peering into the clock's iridescent face, the way one might stare down an adversary. Nadia was never quite sure what to make of it. "What on earth are you doing, my dear?" her mother would ask. "The clock," "It watches me," is all Isabeth would say. Nadia was always left standing, awkwardly, in the shadowy hall. After her daughter had gone, she would approach the clock gingerly, trying to feel what Isabeth had felt. But she could never feel anything but the vague uneasiness. Things took an odd turn when suddenly the nightmares began. Each night at 3 a.m., Isabeth would awaken, screaming. It was a blood-curdling scream, the kind that caused one to freeze upright in bed, unable to move. Servants inevitably rushed in to assist her. They always found her in the same posture, in a tight ball under the covers, face on knees. When she was extricated from her sheets, she always seemed oddly surprised, as though she'd been set free from a terrible trap. Then she'd roll over and go right back to sleep, as though nothing at all had happened. This went on for a fortnight. Various attempts were made to explain the sudden appearance of the nightmares, but no solution could be found. When queried, Isabeth could never really recall what had happened to cause her to scream, but she felt, vaguely, that it was somehow connected with the front hall and the clock. After 2 weeks of disturbed sleep, Nadia became desperate. The staff looked half dead, and she was at her wits' end. Determined to find a solution, Nadia decided that, since Isabeth seemed bothered by the clock, perhaps she should try having it removed for a while. She called some friends at the local antiques dealership and asked them if they would be willing to keep the clock for a spell. They reluctantly agreed. After all, who would want to take on the protection of such an expensive heirloom? Removing the clock was a massive undertaking, but in the end, Nadia was glad she'd gone through with the operation. Almost immediately, the screaming stopped. Indeed, Isabeth slept soundly for another fortnight. After 2 weeks of peace, Nadia was on the verge of declaring the whole experiment a rousing success. However, she soon discovered that she need not have been so bold. On the 14th night, instead of screaming, Isabeth rose precisely at 3 a.m. In a dreamlike state, she walked out of her room, down the upper hallway, down 2 sets of stairs, past the landing, through the gallery, all the way to the front hall, where the clock once stood. There, she stood absolutely still for about 10 minutes, and then, as if someone had snapped his fingers, she'd awakened, startled and confused. This was all discovered through pure chance. A servant had risen to get a glass of water because she couldn't sleep. When she entered the front hall, she saw Isabeth standing there in her nightdress. Then, while she watched, Isabeth seemed to stir and look around. It was clear the girl had no idea why she was in the front hall. The same set of events transpired on the following evening. This went on for another 2 weeks. That's when Isabeth began to see the girl. At first she was a small, clear light, strangely fog-like and murky. However, as time passed, she became more and more distinct. The first time it happened, Isabeth didn't know whether she should stay and observe the strange apparition, or run screaming from the hall in terror. She chose the former, much to the relief of the rest of the household. This went on for some time, the walking, the waking, and the seeing of the bizarre glowing girl in the hall. However, it was tolerated, because Isabeth didn't seem to mind, and neither did anyone else. No one was being awakened at 3 a.m. No one's sleep was being disturbed, and Isabeth rarely spoke of it. Indeed, a kind of routine developed. The only thing that seemed to change was Isabeth's location. Sometimes she was directly across from the clock. Other times she was kitty-corner from it. Sometimes she was down the hall farther. It became a game among the servants to bet on where she would turn up from one night to the next. Indeed, the serving staff drew lots each evening to determine whose sleep would be disturbed. In most cases, the servant who won would have to rise at 3 a.m. and take a peek over the banister to see where she was. The following morning, The staff member would report Isabeth's location on the previous night, and payouts would be made. One December night, Susan, the pantry maid, drew the shortest straw. However, her room was in a different part of the house than much of the serving staff because her room was located right next to the kitchen. This is why, when Susan came to the front hall, she was able to see not only Isabeth, but also the little ghost. Isabeth had awakened several minutes before Susan's arrival and, therefore, had heard her approaching. Isabeth turned to look at Susan, but the maid seemed not to see Isabeth at all. She was completely mesmerized by the shimmering light glowing softly at the base of the wall where the clock once stood. Isabeth was completely unmoved by the sight of the ghost in the hall. She'd seen it for weeks. Instead, she looked at Susan and asked, "What are you doing up?" "Who is that?" pointed Susan, ignoring the question. "The girl," Isabeth answered quite naturally. "She comes every night." "Does she always look like that?" Susan moved closer, calmed by Isabeth's seemed indifference. She studied the strange apparition, unable to take her eyes from the figure of the ghostly little girl who sat with her face down and her knees drawn up. "Yes, she's always in that position. I don't know why." Isabeth shrugged. "She seems sad." "Does she move?" Susan took another step forward. "Does she speak?" "I've never tried to speak to her," Isabeth replied. "All I know is she doesn't move, and she never looks at me." "I wonder if she'd speak to you if you addressed her. She must be here for some reason, mustn't she? I mean, you don't just camp out each night in a drafty hallway for no reason, do you?" Susan reasoned. "I don't know." Isabeth shrugged again. "It's not as though she can feel the chill." "For shame," Susan said quickly, chastising her in a harsh whisper. "You know not what she feels." "True, but neither do you," Isabeth challenged. I suppose that's true enough," Susan admitted. A brief silence followed before she spoke again. "It is odd, though, her sitting there like that. I feel like she's here for a reason, but I don't know what it is. Like she has something important to say, but she doesn't speak." "Maybe you should try speaking to her," Susan suggested. "I don't think she'd speak with someone else here. I'm not sure why." "Well, maybe I should go back to bed then," Susan whispered before attempting to tiptoe away. Just then the glowing figure faded in brightness and disappeared. "She's gone," Susan breathed, walking forward suddenly. "Aye, she does that. She's only here a short while," Isabeth answered nonchalantly. "I wonder where she goes," Susan said, not really expecting an answer. "I've often wondered why she suddenly started appearing. The clock was always there before, wasn't it? It's odd. I used to walk down this hallway after dark all the time, but I never saw her until recently," Isabeth replied. Susan grew brave and moved closer to the wall. On a whim, she began running her hand through the air near the place where the spectral girl once sat. She glanced absently at Isabeth and noticed the girl's confused expression. Slightly ashamed, Susan began tapping on the wainscoting instead. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for, really, except some clue as to where the ghost might have come from, or where she might have gone. At one point, as she patted an area of the wall, she was startled by the strangely hollow sound that emanated from it. "I wonder what that is," Susan murmured. "What do you mean?" Isabeth saw the look of wonder on Susan's features. "Is there something there?" "I'm not sure," Susan answered, before kneeling down to knock more aggressively. She started near the place where the spectral girl had just been seen, and then moved down the hallway, rapping on the wall as she moved along. There was no mistaking it. The area behind the clock sounded different than the rest of the wall. "It is hollow there," remarked Susan, walking back toward Isabeth. "I wonder what it means," Isabeth wondered aloud. "There must be an empty space behind the wall," Susan suggested. "Maybe the little ghost is guarding something. Maybe there's a treasure." "Or maybe a grave," Isabeth countered. "Why must you be so morbid?" Susan sighed. "It's just as likely as a treasure." "Who'd bury someone in a wall?" Susan challenged skeptically. "Someone who didn't wish to be found out, I suspect." "Ugh!" Susan shivered, looking up and down the long, dark hallway. "Let's talk of something else." Isabeth merely sighed and began to walk back to her room. "Will she come tomorrow, do you think?" Susan pursued. "Most likely," Isabeth remarked, not turning around. "If she does, I think you should try speaking to her. Try to find out what she wants." "Perhaps," was all the answer she received. The following night, Isabeth awakened at 3 a.m. and walked down the hall as usual. Again she encountered the young girl who sat with her back to the wall and her knees drawn up. Isabeth said nothing for several minutes, gathering courage. She pretended her bravery in Susan's presence, but there, alone, with the strange apparition, she was terrified. Suppose the ghost was angry? Suppose it didn't wish to be disturbed? In the end, however, Isabeth collected her wits and spoke. "Why do you sit there?" she began in a voice that was barely audible. The ghostly child sat perfectly still, its posture unmoved for several moments. Then, as if roused suddenly, the little head came up, and the face of a young girl was clearly visible in its evanescence. And then a voice, like wind in dry grass. "I sit because I cannot stand. I stay because I cannot leave." Isabeth did not answer at first, taken off guard by the sound of the voice. How often had she shared silence with this little ghost? Now they spoke, two girls in the same hallway, separated by time and life. "Why can't you stand?" Isabeth asked finally. "And why can you not leave?" "I stay because I cannot leave. I sit because I cannot stand," the girl repeated. Never one to be sentimental, Isabeth dove into her questioning, determined to get to the bottom of the child's sudden appearance. "Well, how long have you been sitting there?" "I cannot tell how long I've been here, behind this clock. It counts away the hours, day and night and day. I hear the hours fly away." "I imagine that's quite true," Isabeth began, noting the girl's antiquated clothing. "But you can't have heard the clock much lately. I know because we've had it removed. It unsettled me so." "And what now?" asked the ghost. "What do you mean?" "Are you settled?" pursued the ghost. Isabeth paused at this. "No, I suppose not. Here I am, after all, rolling about in the middle of the night. But I don't scream anymore, at least." "So much better for the rest of them, I should think," replied the ghost with a hint of sarcasm. "Well, what of you? We're both here at this hour, aren't we?" spat Isabeth. "I can't help it," snapped the ghost. "Who can blame you for what you see?" And then, in a huff, she vanished. Isabeth was equally miffed. She crossed her arms impatiently and marched up the stairs to her room. The next day she told Susan everything that the girl had said. As she spoke, Isabeth noticed that one of the older maids in her mother's employ was watching them closely, listening to every word. "How now?" Isabeth said rather loudly, staring at the woman. "What do you find so interesting?" "I meant no harm," Bertha answered, rising from her chair and coming closer, I just couldn't help overhearing. You're talking about the little ghost, aren't you?" "Aye," Susan began. "Isabeth sees her." "The little girl?" Bertha murmured. "Yes," began Isabeth. "I think I made her quite cross with me last night." "She speaks to you?" Bertha seemed surprised at this. "Yes," Isabeth answered matter-of-factly. "I've never spoken to her, but I, too, have seen her," Bertha began. "Years ago, when I was a girl, like you. I think she only appears to young girls about her age who come into the hall when the clock's gone." "When did you see her?" asked Susan. "Oh," Bertha chuckled, "many years ago now. My mother worked in the laundry back then. I was maybe 12 or 13 at the time. I remember that the clock was being repaired and had to be taken out. It was a rare thing, I recall. A clock that heavy isn't easy to move, you know." Bertha paused, recalling events. "I remember I woke one night, came downstairs and saw her sitting there. When I asked my mother about her, she hushed me and told me never to speak of it. She was very superstitious. But I was a curious girl. When I could get no answers from her, I asked one of the other servants. It was Miss Watkins, the scullery maid, who finally told me who she was." "Well, what did she say?" asked Susan. "She told me a dismal story," Bertha began. "And I'm not even sure I have the right of it. Miss Watkins heard it second-hand. It's a very old story." She paused, gaining momentum, and then began to tell the story. "She was the daughter of a poor woman in town who came to work in the house. This was a time of old Lady Rose's mother, Julia, mind you. She was in her prime then, not yet 30, I believe. It was many years ago. Queen Victoria had not been on the throne very long, as I recall. This poor girl was ordinary in every way except she suffered from a sleep disorder which caused her to walk about when she was sound asleep. Virtually every night she rose from her bed and walked the halls. After several years, it came to seem normal, and no one even remarked on it anymore. Indeed, the situation became so routine that the girl actually began sleeping in her slippers so she wouldn't catch a chill from walking on the cold floors after nightfall." "What time did she rise?" Isabeth asked curiously. "I don't know," Bertha shrugged. "But very late at night, I think. Just a few hours before dawn." "Why?" "It's at that time she wakes each night," Susan answered, motioning toward Isabeth. 3 o'clock, Isabeth remarked. Bertha looked at her for several moments, a kind of sad interest spreading on her features. "Aye, so it was with her. She rose, and no one paid it much mind. It became routine, the way a thing will, given enough time. The situation was never cause for alarm because everyone in the house knew about her condition. However, things turned tragic one winter's night. It was right before Christmas. At that time, Christmas trees were novelty items enjoyed by the wealthy. They were, therefore, displayed in places of great prominence. That is why the front hall was chosen. The location offered not only a wide open space for lights and decorations, but was also in close proximity to the marble fireplace where the stockings were hung. Well, on Christmas Eve that year, some thieves broke in, most likely drawn by the prospect of holiday gifts waiting there. You can imagine their surprise when, in the midst of their crime, they noticed a young girl standing in the front hall. She couldn't see anything, of course. She was just standing there, asleep. But these thieves would have no knowledge of her strange condition. They would have assumed that she caught them in the act. No one is sure what happened next, but it is widely suspected that foul play occurred. One of her slippers was actually found in the snow, several miles from here. Some assumed she was kidnapped, while others were sure she'd been killed and the body disposed of somehow. I'm not sure when the ghost first appeared, but it must have been several years later when the clock was removed from the front hall again. She's only visible when the clock is removed, you understand. It's said that she always appears in the place where the tragedy occurred. Terrible, murmured Susan. Why do you suppose she's always sitting with her head down? Asked Elizabeth. No one knows, remarked Bertha. She said that she could neither stand nor leave, asked Elizabeth. Is that what she told you? Bertha inquired. Aye, Susan interjected. She repeats it, according to Elizabeth. It is odd. True, 'tis strange, Susan stated. Clearly there's a mystery in all of this. Well, there's nothing else for it. You'll just have to speak to her again, Elizabeth, Bertha remarked. There's no other way. That night, as before, Elizabeth rose at 3 a.m. and walked down into the hall. The phantom girl sat, back against the wall, just as before. A soft white light emanated from her in the darkness. It was both comforting and eerie. Bravely, Elizabeth addressed the girl again. Why do you sit there? She asked. I sit because I cannot stand. I stay because I cannot leave, replied the ghost. Why are you not visible when the clock is in its proper place? The clock is more than just a clock. It hides the spot. It hides the spot. What spot? Asked Elizabeth. A stain? The clock. You cannot see. It hides the place that hideth me. You make no sense at all, Elizabeth fumed with impatience. You speak in riddles. Speak plainly. The clock, you cannot see. It hides the place that hideth me, the ghost repeated. Elizabeth merely shook her head, confused. She paced the floor for several moments, trying to make sense of the ghost's riddles. In time, the apparition disappeared completely, and Elizabeth found herself alone in the hall, once more. The next morning she told Susan all that she'd heard. Susan considered the ghost's riddles, shaking her head frequently. Suddenly her face went white. She sat forward in her chair, her hand covering her mouth. Have mercy. It can't be, she began. What? Elizabeth peered into the woman's face curiously. She said that the clock hides the place that hides her. Old Bertha said that the girl's slipper was found miles from here, but that was just her slipper. The girl isn't gone. Don't you see? She's still here. You mean... Elizabeth released the breath she'd been holding. I mean, the clock. It hides where she is. Susan looked Elizabeth in the eyes meaningfully. She's still there, in the wall. Who would do such a thing? Elizabeth exploded. Aye, indeed. Who would hide a little girl in the wall? And why would they get away with it? Elizabeth paused, realizing the rudeness of her next question. I mean, wouldn't it smell? How was it not discovered? I don't know. Susan's head moved side to side very slowly. They sat quite still for several moments before Susan seemed to come to life. She took Elizabeth's hands and looked in her face almost imploringly. You know what you must do, eh? Tonight you must ask her. You must confirm it. If she says it is so, what we think, then we must open the wall. Susan answered flatly, as though there could be no argument. Aye, Susan nodded. She's been in there long enough. At 3 a.m., Elizabeth opened her eyes and found herself, once again, in the front hall across from the wall where the clock once stood. Within moments, she saw the little ghost appear opposite her. Elizabeth began in the usual way. Why do you sit there? She asked. I sit because I cannot stand. I stay because I cannot leave, answered the ghost. Where is your resting place? Far from here? Asked Elizabeth.
I think you know. You do. You do. Behind the wall. I am entombed.
The ghost replied. Elizabeth tried to keep her voice steady as she asked her next question. And who put you there, pray tell? Robbers?
The workmen came to fix the clock. They came and took it all away. They saw the wealth and began to plot. They planned to rob the house some way.
Elizabeth almost snapped her fingers. It made perfect sense. She paced, speaking as she walked. Of course they did. They'd seen the house. They knew its layout. They planned to do it right before the clock came back. Great-Grandma Julia would have insisted it be back in time for Christmas. They decided to break in on Christmas Eve. Then they could reinstall the clock in the morning of Christmas Day. Of course, they'd be eliminated as suspects. Who robs a house and then returns to it the next day? But what about the girl? They didn't expect you, though, did they? That part wasn't planned. They didn't know about your sleepwalking. The girl's face was turned downward once more. But how did they? She paused. How did they hide you? Where? In the wall? She asked, finally almost fearful of the answer. The ghost looked up at this. They shared a long, even look. Their faces were so similar. Their ages so close. They might have been friends, cousins, sisters even. Finally, the ghost answered her.
This house is old. It's not like new. This is no wall, but another room. You see me here, but not inside. Within you'll find the place I hide.
A second later, she vanished. Another room, murmured Elizabeth. It isn't a wall at all. It's another room. There was a long pause as she considered this. How would they have known that there was a room behind the clock? They were workmen, not architects of the house. From the darkness of the hall, she heard the little ghost again.
I tell you true. There were not two that came for me that evil night, but three. But three came in to thieve, and bury me without warmth or light.
A third man. Elizabeth stepped forward. Another workman. Another man who come to fix the clock.
One who knew the wall was deep. No workman knows this house so well. Only heirs are privy thus. It was by his hand I fell.
Whose hand? Elizabeth demanded. If it were a relative of mine, I've a right to know.
The heir, own Walter's blood, the only male, the only son.
And then it was like a dam breaking inside of her. The old story. It made sense, all of it. All of it going back to when she'd first heard about her grandmother's Uncle Colin. All of it coming back to her in the oddly vivid way that children recall the stories of long-dead relatives. She remembered Grandma Rose's references to Colin's quirks, his nervous twitches, his inability to relax, the number of brandies he'd drink in one sitting, his obsession with the clock remaining in its rightful place in the front hall, the way he'd become angry if anyone started snooping around the house. It all made sense now. She recalled the hushed talk about him, his gambling debts, his trouble with alcohol and women, the way he'd gone to ask for an advance on his inheritance all those years ago, and his parents' refusal. She imagined him planning it all out, him deciding to call in the workmen, men he'd probably promised a cut if it all went according to plan. But one question remained. How would they retrieve the stolen items if the clock was back in its place? There's another way in. Elizabeth said it out loud. Of course, there'd have to be another way in so he could go in, get what he needed, and get out again without raising suspicions, and people never look right under their noses. Never. That's why they never found the body. She had walked some distance from the wall in her thoughts, but she stopped and turned back suddenly, walking quickly toward it. She put her hand on the wainscoting. "Where are you?" she asked in a shaky whisper. "I can't help you get out if I don't know the way in."
The way is here. Just here.
A light appeared, glowing softly on the wall just a few feet from where she stood.
Just pull the latch, and the way is clear.
She moved toward the light, allowing her fingers to roam along the grooves in the woodwork. Suddenly she felt it. There was a small latch, invisible to the eye. Her first instinct was to pull on it, to open the door, but being practical, she knew she must wait until sunrise. Otherwise she wouldn't be able to see anything, even with the spirit's glow.
"Wake me, will you?" she asked the ghost. "At daybreak. I can't see much now."
In response, the light glowed more warmly for a moment, and then went out. She noted the place on the wall. Then, moving into the front hall, she lay down on one of several sofas. Just as the sun peeked over the horizon, she woke with a start. It was just light. No one was stirring. She rubbed her eyes, rose, and walked toward the wall. She moved her hand along the wainscoting, searching for the lever that she'd found before. She'd fitted her fingers into the grooves of the wood where the light had shone softly a few hours earlier. Then, suddenly, her fingers caught on what felt like a bent metal nail. She wiggled this, curiously, her thumb finally knocking it loose. There was a sigh of stale air and a creak of ancient hinges as the hidden door made itself known. She pulled forward on the wooden door, suddenly timid. It was very dark inside. She knew she must enter to see what she must see, but she hesitated, fearfully, at the edge of the dark mouth that yawned before her.
"Do not fear,"
the little ghost whispered reassuringly.
"I am with you."
A soft light radiated in the darkness, growing brighter by degrees. Slowly, Elizabeth entered the room. The air was sour, dank, stale, heavy. She felt sick in her stomach, but she moved forward. She had to. She felt that. This girl, this ghost, was depending on her in some way. She moved further into the casement. This had once been a private parlor of some sort. There were no windows except in a small adjoining closet. There were plaster walls covered in fabric with wainscoting underneath. There were several small couches, a mahogany table, and a trunk pressed against one wall. A trunk. Normally, an item like a trunk would have gone completely unnoticed. She would have scanned the room and made no note of such a thing. But there, in the room, the trunk took on a dark, oddly sinister quality. The words of the little ghost echoed in her consciousness suddenly.
"I sit because I cannot stand. I stay because I cannot leave."
A key lay on top of the trunk. Elizabeth moved forward and took the key between her fingers. She contemplated its significance, what it could mean. A heavy hitching emotion rose in her chest, and she found that she could hardly breathe. A tear stung her eye as she leaned down to put the key into the lock. It turned roughly, pulling the rusted arm out of the sleeve. She was torn between two impulses: throw open the chest in one swift motion, or run away. She found that she could do neither. She was afraid to flee, afraid to look inside the trunk. She sat there on her knees for nearly a quarter of an hour. Then, turning sideways, she allowed herself to fall limply against the wall. She ran her hand over the lid of the chest, trying to will herself into action. She must do this thing. The servants would be downstairs soon. What would they say to her if they saw her in there? She took a deep breath gaining resolve. Then she took hold of the corner of the chest and pulled upward. She did not turn her head at first. She rose to her feet and took a step away from the chest before turning. Inside, the girl's head was down, her face pressed against her knees. Her hair, once brown, had gone an ashy gray. Skeletal shoulders arched downward over bony legs covered in what remained of a dress. Elizabeth scanned the small body and noted that her feet were bare. Why had they removed her slippers? Elizabeth looked at one of the feet, pressed flat against the wall of the chest, and then she understood. The slippers might have allowed her to make noise. She could have kicked her slippered feet against the inside of the trunk and made just enough noise to alert someone outside of her presence there, which could only mean...
She was still alive,
Elizabeth whispered, horror slowly spreading across her features. She looked at the horrid visage again. There were tethers inside the chest for securing items before travel. The men had used these tools to keep her largely immobile. Her mouth, all skeletal, was still gagged with the remains of a lump of cloth.
She suffocated,
or starved, Elizabeth murmured. And all the while she could hear the passage of time, seated here behind the clock that counts the hours. That's what she said. How long did she wait here for the rescue that never came? She looked around the room, seeking the little ghost absently. How long did you wait? A week? 10 days? A fortnight? Just then, a click sounded behind her. An adjacent hallway was revealed, illuminated by the rosy glow of dawn's first light. It was lined with several old burlap sacks. Stepping forward, Elizabeth gingerly opened a sack a few inches. Inside the first bag there were several boxes wrapped in brown paper.
The Christmas gifts, she murmured.
They must have hidden them in this hallway when they disposed of her. She looked over at the girl again, sadly, before speaking again.
They must have planned to hide them in here all along, but you changed things, didn't you?
She spoke to the skeletal girl.
They couldn't risk coming in here to get the gifts with you tied up in here, and later they would not have come in because they were too disturbed by the thought of what they'd done.
But there still had to be another doorway. If the clock was put back, they'd had no way to access what they'd taken, dead girl or not. She began moving the burlap bags. She was sure the answer lay in the short hallway. She found her answer in the far corner. There she found a small doorknob hidden by some loose wall fabric. She walked closer and turned the handle slowly. The creaking door hinges grinded as the door opened by degrees. She couldn't believe her eyes. She recognized the table barring her exit almost immediately. She was in the parlor adjacent to the front hall. The table's location and height masked the outer door handle. How often had she walked through that parlor, unaware that there was a doorway into another room right under her nose? She had no idea the door existed, and she doubted anyone else did either. She closed the door resolutely, putting her back against it, sealing it once more.
"Well, I'd say you fouled that up, Uncle Colin," she began.
"Oh, you killed a child and got away with it, that's true. But you did it for nothing. You never got your hands on any of this treasure either. Poetic justice, I'd say." She would tell Susan everything when she woke. It would be soon, she was sure. Elizabeth walked through the short hallway into the main part of the hidden room again. Out of habit, she scanned it, finding a small clock lying face up on the table. She walked toward it, noting its cracked face. It must have been knocked down in a struggle, she mused. The time on the cracked face read 3 o'clock. A great heaving thing rose in Elizabeth's chest as she gazed at the clock's face. So many years trapped inside. "But you're free now," she announced through her tears. Elizabeth made her way toward the door and stepped out into the front hall again. She paused briefly, turning one last time. "You need not sit, for you can stand. You need not stay, for you can leave." Then, smiling, she turned on her heel and went to wake Susan. Isabeth couldn't be sure, but she thought she heard the jingle of laughter as she made her way up the stairs. The morning sun made its way through the curtains as winter dawn came on fully. It was time to get up.
Deadtime, written by João Pinto, narrated by Jonathan Jones. Have you ever heard of sleep paralysis? Sleep paralysis is a condition that causes people to be unable to move, either when falling asleep or waking up. It is often accompanied by night terrors and particularly vivid nightmares, all of which can be more than a little disturbing when you find yourself at your most vulnerable and unable to react. Its physical causes remain a mystery, but the condition is sometimes directly related to psychological factors such as built-up stress. I suppose it shouldn't have been much of a surprise that the torment that haunted my early teenage years returned when I moved to a rundown suburban neighborhood in Louisiana. The block I lived on was a textbook example of the frenzied building of the late 90s that led to the subsequent housing crisis. Prices plummeted quickly when the builders realized no one wanted to live near a bog, miles away from any major city. To me, however, it was perfect. Being a web designer meant I could work from home, and although it took a while to get used to using mosquito nets, the house, for its asking price, was a real bargain, and included a porch, a garage, and even a space in the attic that I planned to transform into a home theater and game room. It also allowed me to set my studio and bedroom apart and provided me with extra space if friends wanted to drop by. Fresh out of college and ready to get on with working, it promised to be everything I could wish for, except that it had been so poorly maintained. I'm not talking about superficial, easy-to-fix stuff. Either the soggy paint and weed-infested porch I could take care of myself, but the multiple leaks and crackling wiring represented a whole different sort of beast. Fortunately, my parents came over and some really nice neighbors volunteered to help, probably happy to see a fresh face amongst the row of empty houses. Even the local pastor came by, a chubby little man who served ours and 3 other equally deserted parishes and did his best to keep the small, nearby church from falling into ruin. By the end of the month, my home looked as gorgeous as it could ever be. After several weeks of continuous home repairs and working at my computer, both almost non-stop, and in spite of the clearly friendly, welcoming community, the stress and exhaustion hit me hard. The first night it happened, I woke up in a sweat, as if startled by a distant scream that faded away the moment I regained consciousness. Trying to switch on the light, I found my arm immobilized, buried beneath a tide of blankets that might as well have been made of lead, trapping all my limbs beneath its crushing embrace. I sighed. Not this again. You know that Henry Fuseli painting that depicts a young maiden laying on her bed with a fat, piggish imp sitting over her? The Nightmare, I think it's what it's called. That's what this felt like. A nightmare that's absolutely terrifying as it hits you before you have any idea what's going on. However, I was already what you might call a veteran at this stuff, and as soon as I recognized it for what it was, I tried my best to go back to sleep before I wasted an hour looking at the ceiling wishing I could go back to sleep. I tried counting sheep, trying to mentally solve complex math while forgetting half the numbers, you know, the usual tricks. At last, after a relentless battle, I finally fell into a listless slumber and woke up just as tired as I had been when I laid down. One of the things that makes each sleep paralysis condition unique is its frequency. The luckier of those afflicted will suffer from the condition only once and are then free from it for the rest of their lives, while others, it's a monthly occurrence. My case is fairly peculiar in that it rarely raises its ugly head, but when it does, it comes on full force in strings of consecutive episodes spanning weeks. Well acquainted with the pattern, I expected another restless night. One of the few productive things I did that day was tilting my window blind slightly so I would be able to spy the magnificent view of chipped paint and overgrown bushes that filled the horizon. All humor aside, this was a trick I'd come up with as a teen. It helped me to cope with my problem. Poster-worthy or not, any view during one of my nighttime episodes was better than complete blackness. And being an early riser by nature, the morning sun wouldn't bother me at all. Nothing unusual happened that night, and I was relieved to wake up refreshed and ready to make up for everything I should have done the day before. Still, I was experienced enough to know that one good night didn't mean the cycle was over. I was careful to not overwork myself. I figured there was a good chance I'd need to conserve some strength. The paralysis did, however, return, as certain as nighttime itself. So there I was again, frozen in my bed, at least this time with enough light in the room to be able to see exactly what time it was. The clock read 3:32 a.m. Not a pleasant surprise, but things could have been worse. The faster I fell back to sleep, I thought, the more rested I'd feel in the morning. Between the blinds, I watched as streetlights projected yellow shapes onto the dirty white walls of the nearby houses, giving ghoulish life to swaying tree branches. I was moments from closing my eyes when something else caught my attention. It was a silhouette of a man or a woman, I couldn't tell, making its way through our empty streets in the dead of night. I remember thinking how odd it was for someone to be out this late, particularly an elderly person, as the heavy, limping stride seemed to indicate. Although I am not typically the type to stick my nose in other people's business, I couldn't help but spy on this figure as it passed. I had nothing better to do, was unable to move, and knew too well that my night's slumber was already ruined. In considering the state my own home had been in when I bought it, it wouldn't have come as any surprise to me if someone was out there now for the express purpose of looting the vacant, unsold houses. The stranger, however, did nothing out of the ordinary and would have been completely unremarkable if it weren't for the fact it was after 3 a.m., and that he was alone, and on my street. Slowly shuffling, the shadowy figure made his way through the neighborhood, passing a little too close, I thought, to the front of my house before merging with the night and disappearing from my line of sight again. Maybe I was making too much out of it, I thought. Perhaps it was just some old eccentric, every town's got one, or some drunk rambling around after downing a bottle or two. But my concerns began to grow when the exact same thing happened during my paralysis the next night. After an uneventful day during which I tried to relax and set work aside in order to regain some stability, I woke up this time at exactly 3:22 a.m. I watched the same figure again pass my house before vanishing into the darkness. He, I found myself assuming that it was a he, had to be up to something. I couldn't see his face in the shadows of the streetlights, obscured as it was by what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat. I tried to remember if any of my neighbors had a limp leg, but no one came to mind. I wasn't surprised, though, and reasoned that I had yet to meet everyone who lived on my street. Much of the population had made themselves scarce, and for all I knew, someone could have fallen and hurt himself in the weeks since the initial flurry of welcome to the neighborhood visits. The day and night that followed went smoothly, without anything worthy of mention. I did ask around, though, as inconspicuously as possible, to see whether anyone knew of someone who resembled the man I saw during the late-night crisis. No one had any clue who or what I was talking about. By the end of the day, I feared my neighbors had me pegged as an unhinged lunatic. That night was when I started to notice the stuff that didn't fit with the "it's just a limping neighbor" theory. As I'd expected, the man returned at his usual hour, went on his usual walk, and took his usual path. Exactly the same path. I mean, literally. He stopped to catch his breath near the third house down the road, cocked his head slightly as he crossed the empty asphalt, and then tripped, nearly falling over when he got to the intersection. It was impossible, but I swear that if I had counted his steps, I would have found that he took the exact same number of them every night. As soon as he disappeared, I gasped in shock and brought my hand to my mouth. The sleep paralysis was gone. I got up and went straight to the window, lifting the sash and sticking my head out to see if I could catch a glimpse of the shadow skulking away. Nothing. He had disappeared, and along with him, the invisible force which had held me down. Suffice it to say, I was both intrigued and disturbed by what had happened and was quite certain it hadn't been a nightmare. Sleep was now out of the question. I contemplated calling a friend of mine, a self-professed expert in all things paranormal, but realized it was far too late in the day. As a result, I had just one option left. I jumped online and posted my experience on various paranormal boards, hoping my story would remain visible amidst the countless phony ghost pictures that flooded the forums. My post got a better response than I had expected. There were the typical trolls who joked about it being Blair Witch 3, but maybe that was why one user suggested to me that I should videotape the evidence and post it to be reviewed by other posters. I didn't know what else to do, so I obliged, and the following night my camera was set up, facing towards the street. I started the tape recording at midnight on the dot. Sure enough, the stranger showed up again, and I swear went through exactly the same motions again. When it was over and I was able to get up, still a bit heavy on my legs but surprisingly recovered, the first thing I did was grab the camera to transfer the video, hoping to be able to zoom in on the figure and finally see who or what it was. You can imagine my shock when the stranger was nowhere to be seen. I fast-forwarded through the whole thing and he simply didn't appear on the video. Nearly 5 hours of footage of an empty street. That's what I watched. Baffled, I tried to explain my situation on the website and was met with general mockery. However, some of the members insisted I upload the file so they could search it themselves. For anomalies, they said. The results they posted later that evening were bizarre. It seemed that the man had indeed been caught by my camera, but only in a single frame. Somewhere around 3 hours, 22 minutes, and 50 seconds, a human-shaped shadow appeared near one of the streetlights, only to be gone in the next frame. Unnerved, I searched my own video to see if they were ribbing me. No. There it was, exactly 3:22:51. The same blurry silhouette. What I did next, well, why it seemed like a good idea at the time, I'll never know. I guess it was because I was tired and angry at having my nights constantly interrupted. It was now clear this was no normal human being. Despite the warnings of the 2 or 3 geeks on the other side of the computer screen that made it sound so easy to deal with, suggesting that it would be better to just wait until the phenomenon subsided or simply move to another home, I decided to stay awake, keep watch outside, and confront the thing. This is precisely what I've been doing for the last 2 hours, sitting here between the weeds and the bugs and writing this down to document my experience. But mostly to keep me busy until it comes, since I don't expect to be disturbed until our usual appointment. September 23rd, 2011, 3:22 a.m. I really can't expect anyone to believe what just happened, but please, if you have listened this long, you might as well hear me out and at least take my advice and not follow my footsteps. I've messed up badly, and now I may be about to pay the ultimate price for my recklessness. This waking nightmare has this time bonded me not to my bed, but to the horrors I just witnessed. To this moment that may well be my last, but I've got to calm down. I have to calm down and try to explain the best way I can what led me to my current situation. Otherwise, all my efforts will have been in vain. As I said before, I was hiding on the side of my porch, waiting for the thing to make its move, checking my watch and fumbling with my dad's revolver. Now, I'm not the person who normally resorts to violence, and if I had my way, there would have been no firearms in my new house, but my father gave it to me and insisted I kept it, fearing for my safety while I was living alone in such an isolated area. I had just kept it in a box. Never once did it cross my mind that one day I would have to load it. much less use it. My plan was simple. Follow the thing, find out what it was, and scare it away with a few gunshots. In hindsight, the plan was as stupid as they come, but sleep deprivation, outright anger and frustration, coupled with the drinks I'd had in order to gain some courage, all conspired to make it seem a reasonable idea. I started to regret my decision, however, the moment it appeared. Down at the far end of the street, the increasingly familiar black silhouette crept its way out of the shadows, starting its walk along the only path it had ever taken. I checked my clock, and sure enough, it was 3:22:51. I didn't know then, and I can't believe it now. Never mind. I'm getting ahead of myself. The man, let's keep calling it that even if I'm still not sure, painstakingly crept past the first few houses on my block, pausing frequently in front of a wooded gate here or holding onto a lamppost there. I checked again. 3:22:51. Hunched as usual, it crossed the street at a snail's pace, head bobbing as if looking around for cars that were nowhere to be seen. Coughing, the haggard figure stopped to hold onto a traffic light. I shivered when my watch reported back, 3:22:51. Down the road and a turn to the right in slow, heavy steps he shambled. I refused to believe it was still 3:22:51. All the bravado I had gathered from the day, internet, and bottle drained away, and I found myself skittering back to the front door, desperately trying to force it open so that I could retreat inside and hide in my room. But the knob wouldn't budge. It was as though it had turned to stone. No matter how much strength I put into it, it remained in its original position as if paralyzed. The realization struck me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just the doorknob. All around me, the usual autumn breezes were dead. Leaves were glued to the ground. Tree branches were as immobile as metal statues of themselves. In the sky, the moon shone steadily between the unmoving clouds, working together with the dim streetlights to cover the stranger in a sickly greenish glow. The form was still approaching and almost upon me. This close, I could see it more clearly. The dark, moth-eaten jacket and pants, the patches of gray, long, uneven hair crowning its features in shadow. But everything else about him seemed blurry, as if coated in a sticky layer of darkness. I edged behind a fence and watched in horror as he passed the front of my house. He seemed to be barefoot and heading towards the dirt road that led to the nearby woods. Even though I was as terrified as I had ever been, I couldn't help it. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the stranger as he shambled down the last of our street before heading into the wilderness. Half afraid he'd stop me and half even more afraid I could be stuck in this, I don't know what to call it, time freeze? The space between seconds? The moment before you start to inhale? Whatever it was, the being was certainly related to the paralytic phenomenon I'd been experiencing. And now I was in this parallel zone with the creature, whether I wanted to be or not. Together we tiptoed past the empty houses, him leading the way without ever stopping, me pausing every once in a while to pat the reassuring weight of the revolver in my pocket. In this way, our two-man caravan abandoned civilization and plunged deep into the undergrowth. The hard, cold metal of the gun should have given me at least a small amount of confidence, but the truth is, I was scared shitless. Every time I'd feel a pebble under my shoe or a twig brush against my head, I'd hold my breath, praying that the thing I was following hadn't noticed. Sometimes it would stop, causing me to gag on a scream while I watched it stagger towards some nearby trunk to lean on for a moment, only to continue marching into the depths of the gnarled woods. That's when I noticed the silence. Following the being through the tangled and wiry bushes that littered the pathway should have made some noise. Instead, not a single leaf rustled, nor did the undergrowth crumple. While I had every reason to be extra cautious, my quarry didn't seem to bother at all and simply plowed through the foliage like a fog creeping in. He was silent too, and it wasn't just him. No, the wretched thing seemed to have contaminated the world all around us. No cricket, mosquito, or owl dared to break the stillness that froze the air. And I couldn't help but wonder if they were all paralyzed in their nests and burrows as I had been in my bed. A rank, putrid stench began to set in as we approached what I suspected to be the nearby swamp. I used to be able to hear the toads as I sat on my balcony during the calm summer nights. There was no croaking this time, but my suspicions as to our location were nevertheless confirmed. Beams of pale green light gleamed on the pools of muddy water, a dark mirror of browns and blacks that might as well have been made of dirty glass. The silence was deathly. No ripple, no frog, no gas bubble disturbed by the water's surface as the stranger stopped and sat at the muddy edge of a pool, almost as if contemplating the sight. His bare feet slumped into the mushy paste of the earth and dried algae without the slightest noise. Under the moonlight, I thought I would be able to see beneath all those baggy and rotten clothes if I snuck just a bit closer. Slowly, I approached the being from behind, half expecting to see toad-like hands and gills carved into its neck, like something out of H.P. Lovecraft tales I used to read in my freshman year. The truth was far simpler and more disturbing than that. I watched as it pulled one of its feet from the muck and water, and with it came the 3 remaining black and withered toes, the cracked, parchment-like skin peeking out from the muddy residue. I let out a gasp and staggered away in shock, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that carcass of a man that I had watched walking down my street night after night. As I stared, unable to take my eyes from it, the rotten monstrosity turned its head to face me. It looked at me with one eye hanging from its socket, its bloated face obscured by its matted hair. Its mouth opened and it gurgled at me, as though commanding my ears to hear his voice. Open wounds and exposed skull, now visible and glistening at me under the moonlight, sent the contents of my stomach back to my throat and filled my mouth with searing acid. Without a second glance, I darted off to the woods, spitting vomit as I ran and silently swearing as I slammed blindly against trunks and branches. The sharp iron-like limbs and leaves scraped against my face, and I ducked my head to keep my eyes safe until I bumped into something heavy and wet and was knocked to the ground. Scrambling, I tried to scurry away from whatever I'd just run into, but my leg got caught on something and I panicked. It only took a moment to see the situation for what it really was. I wasn't caught. My leg was being pinned to the ground. I dropped the gun twice before finally being able to retrieve it and point it at whatever was holding me down. On the other side of my barrel's sight, I met the yellowish gaze of a woman hanging from a nearby tree, staring at me with bulging eyes covered by the same layer of pus and blood that enveloped the rest of her twitching body. A body just long enough for her feet to hold my legs down. All around in the depths of the small forest, I could see now that other things also crawled around. Things far too thin and ragged to be alive. The air was filled with the pungent stench of death. I had to get out of there. Gritting my teeth and rolling away from the thrashing legs of the corpse hanging over me, I held my gun close and rushed towards a dim yellow light I could barely see shining in the distance, ignoring the skinless fingers that dug through the undergrowth and the dripping entrails of another disturbing silhouette impaled on one of the higher branches. I emerged from the woods and found myself in an unfamiliar section of my suburb. The streetlights brought yet more horrors, and I had to force myself to keep running. I darted past a man inside the metal cage of what had once been a totaled vehicle, as he desperately tried to claw his way out of his final resting place. He banged on invisible glass and a non-existent metal frame while yelling to me to save him from the flames, throwing himself repeatedly against barriers that were no longer there. Though I tried, I could not avoid looking at his face, and ran off, likewise pretending to ignore the jumbled mass of broken bones and leftover limbs twisted into impossible angles that inched sickeningly across the sidewalk. Others kept to the shadows, skulking on street corners or behind the veil of dark doorways, just far enough to be out of sight, but close enough for me to hear the slowly increasing sound of footsteps all around me. I kept going. But to where was I running? Returning home was the first thing that came to my mind, but now I could see just how stupid the idea was. Even if I got there, what use would that be if the doors were still frozen? Until the paralysis caused by the apparent rift in space and time, if that was what it was, let up. There was no reason to try to find shelter indoors, since I wouldn't be able to close the doors again on this unholy mass. Unless... the church! I was never a superstitious man, but then I hadn't met any walking corpses before, and from some of the tales I'd read, I remembered that the living dead couldn't walk on holy ground, and that would include everything within the high iron fences surrounding the little parish church, right? Anyway, it was better than doing nothing. At the very least, I could buy myself some time to plan my next step. Shadows shuffled in my peripheral vision as I made it across the second intersection, stopping to take a glance inside one of the few cars parked outdoors in the irrational hope that owners could have left the key inside, and that I could open the door and start it, but the glass only reflected a vision of hell. Looming behind me were dozens of rotting heads staring with unblinking eyes, their mouths agape. Without turning back, I jolted left, only to come face to face with a man in a blood-smeared jacket who looked at me with an almost childlike expression on his ruined face. Without a single thought, I jumped on top of the vehicle, grateful that the windshield held, and cursed myself for having wasted my time. I would have never been able to break in anyway. Leaping off the car's hood and racing towards the final intersection that stood between me and Sanctuary, my heart pounded in my chest as the ghostly crowd took up the chase, the thumping of their feet ever closer, following my own inaudible footsteps. As I turned right, despair overwhelmed me. The far end of the road just before the church vomited a new crawling mass at me, effectively cutting off my best route. With the first horde still hot on my heels, I had no choice but to continue forward, towards the shambling army that awaited me. Or so they hoped. A front yard came into view, which, like the churchyard, was circled by an iron fence topped with spikes. I didn't hesitate to try and climb it. Corpses weren't known for their agility, but unfortunately, neither was I. And I managed only to fall flat on the ground when my grip slipped. Before I could get up, a horrible pain shot through my legs, as if icicles had punctured them, and before I could kick away, more ice-cold vices gripped my right arm. Rolling my head to see what had me trapped, I witnessed the moving face of a woman, with no lips nor gums left in her jaws, whispering at me. She dug her cold, wet fingers into my neck. I tried to punch and kick, but could barely move as more and more bony arms pinned my legs and body to the concrete. I still had one hand free and used it to do what any sane man would have done long ago. I raised my gun. Instantly, some of my assailants backed away, one of them clutching the dry and visible holes in his chest as he did so. And I seized the moment to kick myself free of the last of them and unload the revolver, hoping at least the noise and light would scare them away. The gun spurted only dead air as I felt it ineffectively click through all 6 of its loaded chambers. I dropped the useless piece of metal as I flung myself again at the fence, this time managing to get to the top unharmed, while the ragged crowd recovered from its confusion and their low gurgles gave way to snarls as they came at me again. Dropping down into the safety of the protected yard, I ran as fast as I could around the side of the backyard and dashed over a much smaller wooded fence, just in time to hear my pursuers starting to spill over the porch. Though I was exhausted like I'd never been before, my inner strength was relit by hope. I could see the light of the church. I headed straight for the hill and got back on the main road, ignoring the constant ache of my legs where the icy claws had dug into flesh. The church rose on the horizon, and I took one last glimpse back to see the undead horde still struggling to free themselves from the obstacle which I'd led them. Many were stuck, half in and half out of the iron fence, with a few stuck up on the upper spikes and no way to catch up to me now. This was it. I knew I could make it. The church was just ahead now, and I could see the lights were on inside. And there were people there, others who had taken shelter beyond the churchyard fence, in the light of the sanctuary. I was right, and now everything was going to be okay. I pressed on, telling myself the way the parishioners leaned as they walked was probably because they were as tired as I, caught in the dead of night by this invasion from beyond. I ran, even while trying to convince myself that the gruesome injuries I started to see, even from this distance, were sustained in their own fights to get into the church. I forced my legs to keep moving while weakly holding out hope that I wasn't alone and had finally found help. But when the headstones of the churchyard cemetery came into view beyond the fence, and with them the scrawny, wraith-like shadows that scurried amongst the tombs, I realized I couldn't keep lying to myself. I hide now in this hollow, having run what I hope to be enough of a distance to put me out of their range, and wonder how long it will take until these things depart, if they ever depart. In the now distant town, the ghouls continue to come and go, occasionally sticking their heads up or sniffing the air. It has been 3 hours, 22 minutes, and 51 seconds for a long while now, just as it was when I began to write my story. I need to get the word out, where even though it may not be believed, it will at least be heard and serve as a warning. There are things that go bump in the night, and there is a real risk of venturing too deep into the abyss to be able to return to life. If you wake up paralyzed in the middle of the night, consider perhaps that there is a very good reason why you are unable to move. Just, please, never, ever try to leave the bed.
It all started this past November. I had a major job interview in Toronto at a graphic design firm. They needed me in the city a few days as there were 2 training sessions I had to attend along with this interview. Because I lived in Niagara, about a 2-hour drive away, I decided that it would be wise just to stay at a hotel so I wouldn't have to drive back and forth every day. About a week before the interview, I was at my boyfriend's house looking online for relatively cheap hotels that were close to the graphic design firm. He brought up that I should go on a website called Airbnb, which is an online trusted marketplace where guests can book spaces from hosts like apartments or houses. I ended up finding a woman who was going on vacation for about a week during the exact time I was supposed to be in Toronto. She was renting out her apartment for $50 a night, which I thought was very generous. I ended up giving her a call and we arranged the time I would be coming over. The apartment building was very run down. The windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, and the brick walls were crumbling and discolored. I took a deep breath and considered telling the woman that my interview was canceled so that I could find somewhere else to stay. But $50 a night seemed so perfect compared to hundreds of dollars a night at a hotel. I decided that I would at least check out the room before making the judgment. I knocked on the old wooden door with the number 14 painted in gold and waited a few moments before the woman swung it open and greeted me with a smile. She was a lot younger than I expected, maybe in her late 20s. Her voice sounded so tired and ragged on the phone. I had thought she was at least 50. Her blonde hair was tied up in a messy bun that paired quite perfectly with her blue tracksuit with a small hole in the shoulder. "You made it!" she exclaimed. "Come in, come in." She gestured into the room, which I'm relieved to say was very clean and welcoming. It was definitely one of those don't judge a book by its cover moments. I've always hated that saying, by the way. Heard it too often as a kid. She gave me the quickest tour of an apartment I've ever received, briefly pointing to the kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and hallway closet. It was a small space, but perfect for me. Her place was filled with vintage collectibles, lace, elaborate curtains, old candle holders. I was still examining my surroundings when she interrupted with, "So you're all set then? I'm gonna go." I had barely had any time to speak to her. She seemed to be in a huge rush. "Wait, I said, trying to catch up to her as she made her way out the door, carrying a large backpack. Is there anything I should know? She shook her head slowly, locking eyes with me for a few moments too long. And then without speaking, she left. I made myself comfortable for a little while, unpacking and fixing myself a quick snack in the kitchen. I had about 45 minutes before I had to leave for my interview. I'll skip past the details of the interview, because they aren't even nearly as important as the occurrences that happened afterward. It was very late when I got back. The apartment building was pitch black, except for a small light at the top of the staircase that flickered every few seconds. I used the light from my phone to make my way up the stairs to apartment 14. I wondered who else was living in the building. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. It was too quiet. It took me a few moments to find the light switch on the wall when I entered the room. From the doorway, I was able to see into the bedroom, and the first thing I noticed was that a few of my clothes were sprawled over the floor. I quickly kicked off my shoes and approached the mess, and I came to the conclusion that I must have been in a rush when I was getting ready for the interview and just forgot to clean up. I was tired, so I had a quick shower and jumped into bed. The mattress wasn't very comfortable, but I was so exhausted that I drifted right into sleep. A loud shuffling somewhere in the apartment woke me with a startle. I sat up and squinted to try to see through the darkness, and just before I was about to lay back down to sleep, thinking it was just one of my neighbors in their apartment, I saw a shape. At first I thought it was one of the woman's elaborate curtains playing tricks with my eyes in the dark, but then it moved. Just ever so slightly. The black shape was tall and lanky, and it almost resembled a man, but it was just too hard to see. I inched my arm for the light switch, my heart pounding out of my chest. Just before the light flickered on, the figure fell on all fours and crawled inhumanly out of sight. "What the fuck?" I couldn't help but whisper. With the light now on, I got up and slowly made my way around the apartment trying to find what I just saw, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Without anything else I could do, I went back to bed. There must have been a logical explanation for what happened. It was all in my head. In the morning, I called the woman, and I must have sounded so strange when I asked her if she had anyone else that lived with her that maybe came into the room last night not expecting me to be there. She paused for a while and then answered with no, and insisted she was busy and had to go. I proceeded with my day, going to my first training session. When I came back that night, I felt extra cautious. I brought a knife with me to bed, placing it under my pillow. But I was woken up once again at about 2 a.m. This time the figure was much closer than it was the previous night. I gasped, so filled with fright that I couldn't move or scream. The figure was so skinny. Through the shadows, I could almost make out the ribcage underneath its skin. It was naked. Its face lingered in the dark except for 2 dark circles where his eyes must have been. I tried to scream once again, but it came out like a loud choke. Whatever this was, it reached its finger up to its mouth with a soft shh. The sound was so haunting it sent a shiver down my neck. Shh. Don't tell. I must have been in such a shock that I passed out because when I woke up it was morning. All I could do was cry, so confused. I had never been so scared in my life. It couldn't be real. I was brought up my whole life not to believe in these things. But what if it was actually a disfigured man? Or what if it was something I only heard of in nightmares? I shook my head to rid the craziness. I was probably just having nightmares because of all the stress. I left for my second training session, the very last day I had to be there. When I came back to the apartment around 10 a.m., I couldn't help but linger outside the door. I stared at the large 14 painted on the door, trying to find the courage to lift my key out of my pocket to open it. I told myself that all I had to do was last one more night, and then I'd be gone in the morning. I decided to sleep on the couch in the front room this time. This way, I was even closer to the front door, so I could hear it opening if this thing decided to greet me again. It took me a long time to fall asleep. I watched 12 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and 3 a.m. go by on the clock. I must have dozed off because I woke up from a cold breeze. It was 3:47 a.m. I sat up on the couch to see that the window was open, making the curtains sway in the wind. As I got up to close it, ready to call the police, I heard the soft shh behind me. I closed my eyes and started to cry. Shh. It got louder and louder. I slowly turned to face this creature. It was crouched by the TV just a few feet away from me. It didn't move. It just kept its finger up to its lips. I feared that if I reached for my phone to call the cops, it would come straight for me. "Please," I whispered. It was all I could manage to get out. "Shh. Don't tell," it said. And the scariest thing, since the first time I had seen this thing, was that it started to smile. It was smiling. Although it was dark, I could see the shadowed smile that hasn't left my mind in all the months that have passed. I remained completely still, and it stayed there for a few more minutes before it crawled past the couch and onto the windowsill, looking at me one more time before jumping out. I jolted for my phone and called my boyfriend. I told him everything. I was surprised he even understood me because I was such a mess. "Should I call the police?" I asked frantically. "The police won't believe what you're saying. It's hard for me to even comprehend. I think you need to come home. You sound sleep deprived, and I think it's making you see things." My heart sunk. Even my own boyfriend didn't believe me. "It smiled at me," I whispered. I heard him sigh before saying goodnight and hanging up the phone. I curled myself into a ball on the couch and attempted to sleep, but I didn't. How could I after that? As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and bolted for the door. I had tried calling my boyfriend 6 times to tell him I was on my way home, but no answer. As I opened the door, I bumped right into the woman. She was back early. I didn't even know what to tell her when she asked how my stay was. "Look, I have to go. My boyfriend isn't answering his phone and I need to get home." I pushed her aside without thinking, just wanting to get to my car. "Why isn't he answering?" she asked with concern in her voice. I wasn't sure why she cared. I shrugged and continued down the stairs. I could see my car through the window on the bottom floor. I was so close to escaping. "Did you tell?" I heard her say softly from her room. "You told, didn't you?"
The Owl by Aaron Shotwell, narrated by Otis Jiry. My name is Jake Whitaker. I turned 90 years old a week ago today. It's funny. You go through life knowing that old age will catch up to you, and you still wonder where that time went once it does. At least, that's what the other folk around the retirement home say. I know exactly where my time went. I've seen the world from many perspectives. Everything from the rose-tinted glasses of youth to an old man's tired cynicism. I've learned a great deal of things in my day, but even for someone of my years, some things will always remain a mystery. There are things in life you just get comfortable with, even without an explanation. You just accept them, and you even come to expect them. You stop to think about them every now and then, wondering if there's an answer. But you eventually stop trying. It is what it is. No changing it. No need to. For me, that thing has been around for as long as I can remember. I've walked through life with a very strange companion. My grandfather died in the fall of 1931. It wasn't anything tragic. It was just his time. He survived until he eventually became senile. His life was already over as far as I was concerned. Sure, I was sad to see him go, just the same as any other little boy would be. But I watched him fade away, and I knew he wasn't my grandfather anymore. He just wasn't in there. He was gone. So I didn't cry at his funeral. I had done plenty of that once I realized that he had forgotten my name. I just said my goodbyes and washed my hands of it. I did a lot of remembering, though. I remembered all of the things about him that mattered to me. I remembered all of the quarters that he pulled from behind my ear, all of the walks in the park, and the short games of catch before he'd start complaining about back pain. You know, the simple things that made him my grandpa. I especially remembered his stories. He had a million of them. Most of them far-fetched and funny, and all punctuated with his own laughter. He liked to think that he was the next Mark Twain, but he wasn't as witty as all that. He was just a silly old codger. Still, we all liked to listen to him ramble on, and that was enough for him. The stories I recall most, though, were not the silly anecdotes. In fact, they weren't even stories, not really. They were more like obscure references of the kind you might hear about La Llorona, the Tooth Fairy, or the Boogeyman. The ones I grew up with were about the owl. There was a difference between the owl and those other creatures, though. All of these other creatures you hear about, they're urban legends because there's always a story behind them. Not the owl. Grandpa never told us what the owl was, where it came from, or what it did. The owl was just the owl. The references were never consistent either. We didn't know if we were supposed to fear it or feel safe because of it. One night, he'd tell us not to be afraid of monsters under the bed because the owl would keep them away. Another day, he'd tell us not to tell fibs or eat candy before dinner because the owl was watching. My older brother, Jeffrey, who passed away 5 years ago, God rest his soul, stopped believing in the owl after Grandpa died. He just wrote it off as another of the old man's tall tales. I believed, though. I had always believed, and I knew for sure after the wake. Everyone took turns walking by his open casket to say their final goodbyes, commenting on how peaceful he looked and saying he was in a better place, the usual remarks for the occasion. And then it was my turn. I was only 9 years old, and I still hadn't reached my growth spurt, so I had to stand on my toes a bit to see. The first thing I saw was Grandpa's face in profile, expressionless and pale, and it choked me up the way you'd expect. It was also my first experience with death, so I was much too disturbed to look for long. Then I saw something that no one else seemed to notice. Or, if they did, they didn't make any mention of it. It was tucked away discreetly between the sleeve of his coat and the casket's white silk lining, protruding no more than an inch between them. Just enough to grab my attention. It was a feather. It was long and beautiful. A tuft of snowy white down at the base of the quill, pure silver white with faint stripes of gray along the vein. It seemed so deliberately placed, but I hadn't seen anyone else put it there, and I had been nervously watching the line of mourners move ahead of me the entire time. I almost reached for it, but I knew it wouldn't be proper. For a moment, I forgot about my grandpa. The feather was all I could see, and I felt numb. Nobody else saw it. Nobody would believe me if I told them, but I knew. I knew where it came from. It belonged to the owl. That night was a restless one for me, the first of many. It was a long time before I could sleep comfortably again, because that was the night when it first paid me a visit, in the moonlight. I could just make it out. It was perched on a tree branch just outside my bedroom window, a large and striking great horned owl. Entirely silver in appearance. Even its beak and talons were sort of a dull gray. I couldn't see its eyes as they were sunken in dark hollows. Its crown feathers hung at a lazy slant, and it didn't make the fidgety gestures you would expect from a bird. Its only movement came from an occasional slight twitch, or a light rustling of its feathers in the breeze. It never moved an inch, never made a sound, and it never looked away. It stared through my window directly at me the entire night. I've seen it outside my window every night since. Sometimes it's on my windowsill where I can see its every feather. Sometime across the street in a neighboring tree, but always near enough where I can see it. It was there when I lost my virginity, and I lay awake staring at it as my partner for the night slept soundly in my embrace. It was there during the first night I spent in my first apartment, an apartment in downtown Los Angeles, far from where anyone would expect to see such a bird. It was there on my wedding night, watching me from the window of our new home while I held my bride close. It was there on the night my wife gave birth to our first son, and I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye, staring at me from the waiting room's small window. Once I was hospitalized overnight with a terrible flu. The rooms had no windows, but I knew the owl was watching. I could feel it. It was perched outside in some nearby tree as always, peering at me through the walls. It had always been there, whether or not I think to look for it, always waiting patiently. Waiting for what I didn't know. Truth be told, I still don't know. Never a hoot nor a screech. It never moves and it never looks away. In the latter years of my life, I think I began to understand my grandfather a little better. I understood why he told us those stories, why he tried to make us believe in the owl. I found myself doing the same for my grandchildren. He must have believed, just as I had, that he wouldn't have to feel so alone if someone else knew. It was a quiet call for help. I can't tell you how much sleep I've lost to the dreadful sight of the owl over the years, but I eventually learned to cope. The thing about being haunted is that you just adjust to it, but you never really get used to it. Does that make sense? Things wouldn't seem quite right if it wasn't there as usual, but it's always nagging you in the back of your mind. You can never ignore it, even if you want to. So instead, you try to live with it. You try to make peace with it, and it becomes a routine. For a while, I even tried to interact with the owl, though I don't know what compelled me. Perhaps I wanted to understand the thing, or just to see it do something, anything, other than sit there in silence and stare at me. Maybe I'd teach it some tricks to fetch my slippers or deliver letters. The thought made me laugh. I would often approach the window to open it, thinking maybe I could pet the bird, but it always fluttered away into the shadows before I got too close. Not for long, though. It would always return once I gave it an acceptable amount of space. Sometimes I would place a chair across the window, at a distance the owl allowed, of course. I would sit in that chair and talk to the bird, telling it about my day, my troubles, and my dreams. Sometimes I'd tell it jokes, though I knew it would never laugh. I had hoped the owl was listening, or maybe that it would respond somehow. It never did. It just sat perfectly still, as always, watching me patiently. The owl has been my strange companion, even during these final days of my life. It has never left me, no matter how much I wish that it would. I've been sick lately, and I don't have much time left. The nurses know it. The other residences know it, and I think the owl knows it too. Since I became ill, around the time of my birthday last week, its behavior has changed. It has begun to move, an anxious little shuffle, and it tilts its head from time to time in that impossible way unique to an owl. I can see its eyes now, dull amber beads and pupils wide with anticipation. I think I've even seen it smiling, if you can imagine an owl's lipless version of the expression. I dare not imagine what it means, though I think I can guess. I can see it outside my window, even as I write this story. I sat down at this table to tie up any loose ends, to go over my last will and testament one more time, and maybe write a few letters to loved ones before I lose the chance. Instead, I choose to write about the owl. I just want someone, even if only one person, to know the truth. In the end, I only have one question on my mind. Will someone find the feather in my casket too? I hope it isn't my grandson. I hope he didn't believe the stories. Or he may be the owl's next obsession.
Chilling tales for dark